Thank you. When I received this aforementioned email, and I kind of got to find out what the work was about, I was sort of intrigued by the fact that one of the main points was juxtaposing a film from the late 1970s about the housing estate Lajdanai in the outskirts of Vilnius, which was a sort of large concrete panel housing estate which was in its day kind of cause celeb, won the Lenin Prize, and a film from a couple of years later of Glasgow, and having remarkably similar imagery of sort of, you know, this sort of technocratic modernist future, despite the apparently huge differences between the two places. So, 10 points if you work out what this is. Obviously Glasgow and Vilnius in the late 1970s would seem to be enormously divided by geographical location, by social system, by the particular union they were in. Scotland obviously being in the United Kingdom, as it still just about is. Lithuania being rather less voluntarily in the Soviet Union. And yet the two films and the imagery of the time, and in many ways the architecture of the time, seem to be enormously similar. So yes, so despite the apparent sort of huge difference between, you know, sort of liberal democracy and dictatorship, between a planned economy and a sort of, at that point, mixed capitalist economy, the two things would seem to be very, very similar. But I think one could go further than that and argue that in some ways the Baltic in that era was the part of the Soviet Union that was the most distinctively Western. Its architecture at various points made sort of gestures towards the contemporary architecture of Sweden and Finland. And Scotland, and especially Glasgow's architecture, would seem at the time to be that which most closely resembled that of Eastern Europe. Although in that particular case, you can't find causality. You can find all sorts of examples of Lithuanian or Estonian architects between the late 50s and 80s referring to Finnish architecture as an inspiration. Finding Scottish architects talking about Soviet architecture of any era other than the 20s as an inspiration is almost impossible to find. Maybe in the pages of the Daily Worker once or twice, it might be the Old Scotsman, talking about how fantastic the housing estates were. But generally this isn't true. Yet, the appearance of a lot of housing estates in Glasgow, particularly some of the ones that have been demolished, such as Sighthill and Red Road, look, on a superficial level, extremely similar to those that you will find on the outskirts of any city in the former USSR, whether in the Baltic or otherwise. And I think Stephen Frears is aware of this when making his TV film An Englishman Abroad in 1980, which is what you can see a picture of here. So An Englishman Abroad, for those who haven't seen it, is based on an Alan Bennett play about the spy Guy Burgess. Burgess spied for the NKVD for quite a long time. Was sort of employed by them on a kind of double bluff basis. Burgess used to go and get drunk and tell everyone he was a spy. And they thought this was actually quite clever, and no one would possibly think that the NKVD would employ someone as completely indiscreet as Guy Burgess, but they were employing him. And he did a runner, along with a much more serious spy, Donald Flink. And An Englishman Abroad is sort of predicated on the sort of anecdote of an actress who goes to Moscow to perform, I think with the Royal Shakespeare Company, and Burgess comes along, and they kind of strike up a sort of brief friendship. And in this scene, the actress goes to visit Guy Burgess in his flat. And this, of course, is a typical Moscow block of flats. Everyone in Moscow lives in these. And the eagle-eyed among you, or those that know your Glasgow tower blocks well, will notice that this is Moss Heights in the south of the city, which was the first sort of major system-built high-rise estate in Scotland, one of the first in the country. Now it looks a bit different. It's got these sort of glass balconies over the balconies, so you can't quite get the same sense of it. But this little passageway is still there, far corner, so you can still kind of reenact this if you've got the code. But throughout that film, Glasgow locations are used repeatedly. The suspension bridge over the Clyde is used as sort of stand-in for the suspension bridges over the Moskva, and Glasgow housing estates used to stand in for Soviet ones. Meanwhile, the sort of discourse with which system-built high-rise housing is discussed is one of the phrases that people use on forums and so forth is commie blocks. And this is the result. This is the first result of a quick Google of commie blocks in Glasgow. You come straight to this. There's various things, lots of threads on the forum Skyscraper City. And then you get to this, a picture of Red Road, commie blocks in Glasgow as the headline, and the caption, sadly, apparently to be demolished. So, this idea that mass prefabricated housing is Soviet, and that Glasgow is particularly Soviet, is one which I think is quite popularly held, and is one for which it's very, very hard to find a historical justification, and yet on a kind of aesthetic level it's very, very hard to argue with. So what I'm going to try and do for the next half an hour or so is kind of go through how I think that perception comes into being, whether or not it's got any particular truth to it, what the similarities and differences actually are. And for the most part, I won't be discussing specifically Glasgow or Vilnius, but the kind of general culture of building around them, because I don't think either were nearly as distinctive as they thought they were in this period. Other periods, yes, in this one, not really. So, this is upside down. Oh well. This isn't supposed to look like this. It's not gone that way, actually. It's my fault, probably. So, if you go right far back to the first architecture built after the founding of the Soviet Union, in which Lithuania was not in the Soviet Union but was independent, you can find a certain amount of sort of things that sort of presage, that are kind of blueprints of post-war modern architecture. And you also find a huge amount of paper architecture from that period, of sort of endless cities of high-rise blocks, of sort of modernist collective housing, of a lot of kind of very, very avant-garde stuff in that sort of first 15 years, let's say, from Vladimir Taplin's Monument to the Third International in 1919 till the eventual sort of end of modern architecture in the Soviet Union in the early 30s. In that period, especially at the end of the late 20s and early 30s, you have a huge amount of modernist housing being built. And if you imagine this the right way up, you will know that this is a high-rise block, specifically a block of high-rise housing, with quite small kind of collective units where you would usually not have a kitchen. You would have sort of load of collective facilities in one block, and then you have the housing cells, as they were attractively known, in another block. This one is in Yekaterinburg, which is a very large industrial centre in the Ural Mountains, known at the time as Sverdlovsk, after the person who planned the assassination of the Romanovs. And there's mostly this stuff stays in paper, but there are certain examples of these high-rise blocks actually getting built at that point. Whereas housing in Britain in this period, so we're talking, this was designed in 1928, housing in Britain in 1928, in Scotland or in England or in Wales, pretty much like this. Even cities which have a tradition of apartments and a tradition of multi-storey housing build a huge amount of stuff like this at this point. The 20s and the 30s is more than any other period of Britain, except possibly the 80s, the kind of period of the suburb and the period of the semi-detached house, with a very large garden with lots of trees, and the kind of abandonment of urbanism, if you like, the kind of critique of urbanism and the critique of multi-storey housing, the critique of futurism, and its replacement with an image of a sort of idealised city of the past, an idealised village. And it would be a mistake to sort of politicise this too much. Both of them, at this point, are frequently projects of the political left. The block of housing, which I should have mentioned this is collective housing for secret policemen. This is not collective housing for secret policemen. Although I'm sure there will probably be odd spy in Letchworth. So this is Letchworth Garden City. This is the first of the garden cities, and becomes enormously influential everywhere in Britain as a sort of model of what working class housing should be like. It should be houses and gardens, it should not be flat, it should be very, very green, it should be nostalgic. And the planner of Letchworth and the planner who wrote the kind of minimum standards and the minimum densities that then became mandatory in Britain in the 20s and 30s was Raymond Unwin, who was a member of the Marxist Social Democratic Federation, a close collaborator of William Morris, and very much a believer in the socialist future. It's just that he considered that the socialist future was going to look like this. And Glasgow City Council, which at this point begins its very long period as a one-party state, builds a huge amount of stuff like this in the interwar years, and doesn't really stop building it until the late 1950s, when places like Moss Heights start to take over. So if we're looking at it, say, circa 1930, you have an interest in multi-storey housing, in new technology, and in a kind of futuristic vision of the socialist future in the USSR. And you have, in Britain, on the political left, also on the political right, but I think that goes without saying, an idea of the city of the future that is a sort of non-city, that is a sort of nostalgic image of a kind of medieval sort of Gemeinschaft, a kind of integral community where the worker can dig for vegetables before going to work at the corset factory, which was Letchworth's main employer. And somehow, in the middle of the 1930s, this starts to shift. The first place that it shifts is in the USSR itself, where it goes with remarkable speed, talking from within like about 18 months, really, from being one of the world's major centres of modern architecture, rivaled really only by Germany, maybe the Netherlands, in a period when Britain is a total backwater, to being a country with extreme hostility to modern architecture, and which, kind of a sort of generation of European architects emigrated from France, Germany, the Netherlands, Poland, to the USSR to build cities, almost all modernists. And then within a couple of years, they're all kind of being sent back. And many of them agree to design in a classical style. Many of them end up in concentration camps. A fair few of them end up getting shot. So one of the things that happens in the first phase of this is that housing that's planned in a modernist way as multi-storey blocks starts to get clad. So this is another housing estate in Sverdlovsk, another multi-storey housing estate, again for a fairly elite group in society rather than secret policemen. This is housing for members of the local, the sort of high-ranking members of the local Communist Party. Among the people who has a blue plaque there is Boris Yeltsin, who was the local party boss in the 70s. So this is a high-rise block that's been clad to make it look like a classical block. In fact, I think the kind of bay windows are rather Glaswegian. The kind of very, very heavy stone entrance is maybe more sort of straightforwardly Victorian. So this total kind of loss of faith in an attack on modern architecture happens. And around the same time, there is a increasing interest in modern architecture in Britain. Although that probably shouldn't be overstated. I think it's something which
mainly is the preserve of the London intelligentsia. There are actually very few examples of pure modern buildings outside of North London, really, in the 1930s. Those that want to tell me the 5 exceptions in Scotland, go ahead afterwards. So this is the main precinct of Coventry, and what I was going to talk about at this point is post-war reconstruction. This is, I think, the most kind of celebrated post-war reconstruction in Britain, and sort of after 1945, a sort of huge shift happens in the perception of modern architecture in Britain. Something which I think is inextricably linked to the political and ethical shift that also happens after 1945. So the embrace of the idea of planning, the embrace of the idea of the welfare state, the nationalizations of huge swathes of the economy, the increasing level of trade union power, all of these things also go along with this idea that cities should also be planned, and that the kind of enveloping of the countryside with these sort of endless suburban estates was a terrible, terrible mistake. And that what we should have instead was a sort of serious, planned modern architecture that would be much more unsentimental and the sort of thing you see in Letchworth. And the main, I suppose, icon of this is the main precinct at Coventry, but there's sort of several of these pedestrianised precincts. And they're in a kind of tamed version of modern architecture, if you like, which it's no longer quite so hard line, there's not quite so much concrete anymore, but there's this kind of, it's not based on the traditional city, it's got a multi-level, frequently you can see here the kind of upper level walkways, it's frequently pedestrianised, there's lots of flat roofs, and in this particular case it presents an access to the ruins of Coventry Cathedral. It's a sort of statement of sort of about the horrors of war, really. So on the one hand, there's a kind of showcasing of the disaster, the kind of the disaster of war and militarism and so forth at the centre, and then around that is the kind of new optimistic city of the future. That's kind of how things are done at that point in Britain. Whereas in the USSR, which by this point has annexed Lithuania, but I'm not going to show you a Lithuanian example, I'm going to show you a Belarusian example. This is, I think, the most discussed post-war reconstruction project in the Soviet Union, specifically. The reconstruction of Minsk. Minsk, like Coventry, had been had fairly heavy attentions of the German army. But whereas Coventry, the city centre, had been partially destroyed, and some of the industrial areas had been bombed, Minsk was flattened, and most of its population killed. There's a huge, huge difference here. But the reconstruction of Minsk is a sort of showcase of a completely different way of building and designing, and a completely different approach to symbolism and to aesthetics and to what a building is supposed to say, if you like. So this is the main station square right outside the railway station of the Belarusian capital. And it's, rather than, I suppose, the Coventry example is on the one hand sort of mourns the past and then has this sort of showcase of a sort of completely new future. What Minsk does, and what the architecture of the USSR from about 1945 to about 1956, 57, is about its triumph. Not necessarily a kind of, horrors of war thing, but a kind of, we won the war, fuck you. That's much more how things are done. And given the scale of losses, I don't think we're really in a position to sneer at them for that. But the total difference, I think, should be clear. The symmetry is probably the only similarity. Other than that, the architecture is sort of decorative, glorious, kind of pompous, over the top, covered in sculptures, clock towers, little bits of ornament taken from all over the place, seemingly put on it at random, height and a sort of incredibly dominating sense of symmetry, and also a continuation of 19th century building traditions. There's no kind of new city here, no multiple levels, no kind of new precincts, no segregation of pedestrians and traffic. It's the old city with shops on the ground floor, flats above, and car space going around it. One of the very strange things about the style in this city is how much it resembles the city that Jane Jacobs and the like demanded after 1968. I don't think there's many things in the style in this city planning that someone in the 1980s would have disagreed with, but they didn't usually express it like that. So, so these things are very, very different. The way they express these sort of events of the 20th century in architecture and the way they express post-war reconstruction is totally different. Also, the way they relate to the historic buildings. So various kind of buildings in Coventry survive from before the war, before the reconstruction, but those that were bombed remain as ruins. Whereas the center of, the kind of historical center of Minsk, which is about half a mile out of shot, was reconstructed completely from scratch. And of course, the most famous example of this is outside the USSR, but kind of semi-colonized by it, which is in Warsaw. Another way of kind of seeing this difference before we come to the convergence, which we will, because I do think there is a convergence, but before there's a convergence, there's a big difference. And one way of finding that out is in new towns. Now, if you come out of Cumbernauld railway station, one of the first things you will see is this. This is, I'm probably mispronouncing it, this is a housing estate called South Carbrain, and it's, on the face of it, doesn't look a million miles away from certain kinds of, I suppose, kind of 80s Soviet architecture. And the snow that was on the ground when I went and took this picture also sort of makes it seem faintly East European. And one of the things that was, a major cause célèbre in Western architecture at this point was the new towns. And these new towns were something in which Britain, sort of for the first time really in the history of modern architecture, since Mackintosh really, actually led the way. The new towns that were planned after 1947, and then the sort of second generation, of which Cumbernauld was one, were at the time the sort of European state of the art. Many other countries tried to imitate them. It's particularly surreal when you go to somewhere like Hoogvliet outside Rotterdam, and you realize that you're in a kind of Dutch East Kilbride of everyone cycling. They start out Western, as it were, and then I think later kind of travel eastwards. And one way that you can tell this is by comparing a British new town of the 1950s with a Soviet new town of the 1950s. And as you can see, this is not Cumbernauld. This is a new town, a secret new town, in fact, called Sillamäe, which was built in Estonia, partly for uranium mining. And I think, uranium mining's a probably fairly grim trade. So the architecture is very classical, is kind of in dialogue in some places with sort of local classical traditions. It has this kind of faintly Lutheran clock tower. This is the town hall. And the housing, this is one of the few kind of multi-story blocks. The rest of it is kind of very, very small little pitch-roofed houses, which look very, very like a kind of version of the Garden City. So this thing has happened whereby the Soviet new town circa 1952, which is when Sillamäe is being built, resembles the sort of British garden suburb circa 1932, whereas the new towns being built in the UK have a kind of modern architecture which is much more in a continuation of what was happening in the Soviet sphere in the 20s. And then the convergence happens. And the way the convergence happens is largely through the importance of the concrete panel. There had been experiments in Moscow in the kind of use of concrete panels to kind of try and do classical concrete, as it were. There's one particular block quite near the Dynamo Stadium where you have these sort of imprinted concrete panels that they've tried to make a classical building out of, and it looks very silly. So in 1954, a year after the death of Stalin, Nikita Khrushchev, who by that point had not entirely become leader, these things are rather condensed in the film, gave a speech to the Union of Architects called On the Elimination of Excess and Superfluity in Construction. And the main upshot of that was to eliminate the expense of building things like this. A certain amount of standardization in this architecture, but mostly this was completely freshly designed stuff for fresh sites. There was no kind of sense of sort of blueprints or repetition. You had to do everything anew. That was very much also the case with the reconstruction of places like Minsk. And it was also very, very expensive in material terms. You needed craftsmen, you needed fancy materials, you needed loads and loads of marble and granite to line the halls of all of those palaces of culture. And the decision was, in a country which, it should be noted, had an enormous homelessness crisis, partly because of the war, partly because of the very rapid industrialization of the country, partly because of its inefficiencies, a huge amount of people were living in subdivided houses, or were living in tents or in barracks, or in some cases were living in holes in the ground. So it was decided that you needed to have a mass housing program. And after trying to do this in a classical way, they eventually decided that the way to do this is to industrialize construction. And so what first happens is that the architects kind of have the power taken away from them, as it were, and the engineers start running things, which is always a problem. The first wave is really kind of classical architecture done as cheaply as possible, and it looks terrible. This really is how modern architecture returns to the USSR. Not really because of any great enthusiasm for the idea of modern architecture, which is still fairly heavily censored, still seen as kind of decadent and Western and imperialist, despite its origins in the USSR itself, which couldn't be talked about at that point. So it kind of comes in through the back door, comes in through construction. So the first showcase modern housing estate is in a suburb of Moscow called Cheryomushki, which you can see a picture of here. And here they kind of used a variety of different kind of system building techniques. There was like 5 different bits of the estate, and each one used a different panel, and then they kind of worked out which they liked most and which seemed to work, and then they built that in thousands and thousands and thousands of units on an area about 5 times the size of Europe. So that really is where the dog is buried, as they say. This is really the story of why that kind of convergence happens. If you are going to build loads of stuff really, really fast, using the same panel, it's going to look very, very similar. And at this point, something not hugely dissimilar is happening also in the UK. And before it happens in Glasgow, the first kind of experiments with it are in London. This is, I used to live just next to this. This is the Morris Walk estate, which is currently about to be demolished. It's being decanted, as the lovely phrase goes. And this is the first kind of large panel concrete system building estate in Britain. And it's built basically along a railway line that was treated like a production line. So you'd kind of have a kind of almost sort of huge semi-automated workplace whereby the panels will be made first in the factory, and then they'd be kind of moved along a production line, which you could see in the positions of the housing in many ways, into place, almost like the whole thing was automated. And this sort of begins in the West en masse, but then is taken much, much further in the Soviet Union. So this is a fairly typical system-built estate in Moscow called Belyaeva. This one is kind of famous because of the fact that lots of Moscow artists live there, but that's sort of Moscow in-joke because of the fact that it looks like every other estate, except this one happened to be where all the hipsters lived. Already by the 1970s, there's an enormous reaction to this, to the fact that this looks everywhere the same. And the language by which this is criticized sort of changes depending on where you are on the political spectrum. Basically, in Britain, if you're on the political left, you start describing this stuff as fascist. If you're liberal, you describe it as totalitarian. And if you're on the right, you describe it as Stalinist, which, of course, is not the case, really, in any of those points, really. What this actually is just the sort of logic of applying industrial methods to solving a housing crisis. That's how it looks. If that's what you're going to do, that's how it looks. And in Glasgow, the main reason why the housing looks like it does is exactly the same. If you compare it with housing in the same period in, say, Sheffield or Coventry or Newcastle, it looks much, much less specific. Everything is on a much, much bigger scale and much more system built because there was just a bigger crisis. There was a bigger problem. And it was decided from fairly early on that the way that you would solve this problem was via mass production, and that's what it looks like. It has very, very little to do with a kind of sort of ideological affinity and sort of everything to do with the specific logics of mass production. And in both of these two unions, if you like, there is a critique of the results of this mass production. And that critique varies from place to place, but certain sort of constants could be found in it. So this is, I think, the kind of quintessential modern architecture that is a critique of modern architecture that you can find in 1970s Britain. And this is the Biker Estate in Newcastle, and it's anything but system built. It's straining itself almost to not look system built. But within that, there was this kind of idea that you would have greater participation, rather than just kind of like, you need a house, here's a block, or if you like, a house in East Kilbride. There was instead a kind of, you may want this house, or you may want this house, you may want this house. What do you think of this one? How about this? What about that? The architects are on site famously every day, talking to people there. We're kind of build incrementally, kind of build a small bit and then clear a bit and find out what people liked and what they didn't like. And the whole process lasted about 15 years. And in terms of its architectural expression, it tried very, very hard to not look monolithic, to not look like it was mass-produced. There's still quite a lot of concrete, there's still quite a lot of mass-produced building components, but the appearance is sort of anything but that. And in the USSR, in fairness to them, they were kind of aware of these problems. You can look at critiques really from as early as the late 1960s of mass housing. It was sort of one of those things where I think you could make a critique. Obviously, there were certain things that were off limits in public discourse, but this wasn't one of them. One of the most famous films of the kind of very, very late Soviet era, the kind of no one believes in anything much anymore, but they're getting on with it, kind of the age of stagnation period. There's a film called The Irony of Fate, which is predicated on a kind of hilarious mistaken identity comedy in which someone gets drunk and asks to be, and sort of accidentally gets on a plane and wakes up in another town and asks, not really knowing that they've gone to another town because they're so drunk, gets into a cab and asks to be taken to Lenin Street 22A, Block 5, and is taken to it and goes into an identical block with an identical key, opens the door, goes into an identical flat, falls asleep, and then, of course, the woman comes in and goes, "What are you doing in my flat?" And over the course of the next, 10 hours, they fall in love. So it's a Christmas classic. If you've not seen it, I recommend you do. We have no film like that about mass housing. In fact, we've got Gregory's Girl instead, which is shorter. So there is this critique already, and this is one of the attempts to kind of deal with that critique. This is a housing estate called Chertanovo in the south of Moscow, quite close to the other two estates that I showed you, because it's kind of, that was sort of treated as an experimental area. It was very close to the university, and there were lots of students, and there was kind of like, here is a place where you can kind of try things out, which then got kind of built en masse everywhere else. And Chertanovo was supposed to have sort of loads of different flat types. It had artist studios at the top. It had kind of single-family houses. It had multi kind of occupancy ones. It had maisonettes. Had all these different types. I think like 15 different kinds of houses were all kind of mixed up in this one continuous block. Which this was them trying to not look monolithic. Didn't really succeed. One of the inspirations for it is the Sheffield estate, Park Hill. The kind of big book on the Sheffield housing program, 10 Years of Housing in Sheffield, was translated into Russian immediately and was quite influential. But so you can see that they're sort of trying to escape this kind of logic of kind of block, 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 block. But they can't really do it. Like, they're trying to do it while maintaining the system of mass production and very, very rigid state planning. And so it doesn't work. You couldn't really build a kind of biker in the Soviet Union because the system was just too rigid. The kind of particular way that planning worked didn't allow it. Both are planned, both are welfare state projects, both are public projects, but the particular way the two systems worked made that problematic. So that's, I think, one of the examples of kind of why one system survived and one didn't, I guess. Not that housing of that era in Britain wasn't heavily critiqued, it was. But I don't think a critique of it would become a threat to the system on the whole, which it kind of eventually became to some degree. If you look at any kind of text from the kind of perestroika era, and also the sort of era of sort of campaigning for and then winning independence in the Baltic states, there's almost always a critique of the housing, and we have to live in these terrible, terrible houses. Yet, they survive differently, let's say, to those in Britain. The eventual kind of response to mass public modernist housing in Britain was in many cases one of condemnation, frequently a very, very emotive and very dubious language, frequently based on a sort of social contempt, which is fairly ugly, which I don't think really pertained in the USSR to the same degree because of the fact that the housing wasn't sort of classed in the same way. In many ways, in fact, if you were in a privileged social group, you are more likely to get housing in a tower block. Most of those blocks, particularly people I've spoken to that have grown up in things like the sort of enormous estates on the outskirts of Cornus, have sort of said, well, there was a doctor living next to an academic, living next to a worker, who was living next to a builder, et cetera, et cetera. In many ways, this was the sort of thing that Aneurin Bevan, when he was housing minister in Britain, aimed for. There's a famous kind of quote of his from a speech where he says, we want the housing to be like it is in Welsh villages where, the doctor lives next to the butcher who lives next to the farmhand. Never really quite happened in the UK, although it's only really in the last 25 years that it's become completely sort of housing for those that aren't able to get housing on the open market, which is an increasingly large quantity of people, but who are not always able to get this housing. But it sort of becomes a sort of idea that I think was very, very popular under Thatcher, that this housing was for a sort of social residuum, that those that couldn't get housing everywhere else would get council housing. And that would frequently be in modernist blocks because of the fact that the most popular places to buy, when the right to buy council housing was brought in, were the houses, were the kind of Letchworth type things shown earlier. So that left a council housing as it existed much more modernist than it actually was in terms of what was actually built. And the new Labour government sort of attempt to encourage the sell-off of this stuff eventually sort of leads to the creation of sort of huge, unaccountable quangos like the Glasgow Housing Association, which I believe is and some measures the biggest landlord in Europe, and which sort of parallel with the program of renovation of blocks, had a mass program, as all of you will know, of demolition of blocks. In fact, to the point where they thought it would be a good idea to begin the Commonwealth Games with the demolition of tower blocks, because people would love that. I think the genuine bafflement that they had when people were so pissed off about the kind of the idea of demolishing Red Road at the start of the ceremony, they just didn't get it. Of course, these people just thought, of course, they would hate tower blocks, and that misunderstanding, I think, says a hell of a lot about New Labour. But I digress. So there's a sort of parallel project of renovation and of demolition and of a sort of social residualizing, coming also with the fact that no new mass housing is built at this point, and certainly no new mass housing that is affordable to working class people. Also, some of it is built with, sort of renovated with things that you shouldn't put on top of buildings. If you look at Anniesland Court at the moment, you'll see, the sort of recent cladding removal process, for the fairly obvious reasons that it's not a good idea to cover towers in flammable shit. An idea which wasn't really learned by the Glasgow Housing Association. So the kind of Western example here is fairly kind of problematic, if you like. This housing is frequently condemned, but on the one hand is kind of fought for quite a lot by people that feel it has a certain value, but aren't able to kind of get control of local government enough to actually build any more of it, or spread more of it about. Weirdly, the former USSR and its satellites, particularly those that joined the European Union, have a quite different story. This is the first sort of slide from Eastern Europe that isn't from the ex-USSR. This is from Warsaw, but examples could suffice from Estonia, some bits of Lithuania, and from nowhere in Latvia. I don't know why Latvia doesn't do this, which is basically sort of a European Union-funded program of the upgrading of mass housing, because of the fact that this kind of large panel stuff was frequently badly built. It was usually worse, much more badly built, in fact, than it was built in the West. But in places, many cities which were like 60% or more of the housing in those cities was made like this, it was completely senseless to demolish it. That would just be financially and socially just so prohibitive that I think there was a decision that it was all going to be renovated instead. And it's been renovated where it's been renovated very, very nicely. There's not been any program of decanting. There's been almost no demolition. I can count examples I know of like large-scale demolitions on the scale of the demolition of, say, Red Road or Sighthill in the whole of Eastern Europe on one hand. And that's in cases where they're literally structurally unsound, which is not the case of any of those Glasgow blocks. They were renovated very, very unpretentiously, rather than the kind of flammable cladding and big pointy hats that were really popular over here. Instead, things were just kind of, you put on a layer of styrofoam, and then you rendered it with cement, and then you painted it. And you paved the pathways, and then you mowed the lawns. And it was that simple. And when you go to lots of these places now, you will see kind of new blocks being built, albeit by private investors, that are almost indistinguishable from those that were built in the 60s and 70s. So something quite odd has happened. I think politically these things are quite similar and coming from quite similar places. In many ways, the only parts of Europe that have such fervent a belief in the virtues of capitalism as Britain, particularly England, has is Eastern Europe. Quite why that is one for the historians. But despite that kind of political similarity, the way the mass housing has been treated is very, very, very different. And the mass housing has been treated far, far better, despite the fact that it was far more badly built in Eastern Europe. And I think the main reason for that is because of the fact that it wasn't seen as housing for a sort of, for those that can't get anything better, but seen as housing for everyone. So there's a sort of strange story here where I think these things start in completely different places, and they end up in the same place, and now they've currently diverged to a point in which I think Britain looks more impoverished than the countries that's actually richer than. And I'll stop there. Thank you.